It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this second World Christianity Seminar this term, which is, as always, run jointly by the Cambridge Centre for Christianity Worldwide and the Faculty of Divinity. My name is Jörg Haustein. I'm Associate Professor of World Christianity here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome today our speaker, Dr. Kyama Mugambi, who is an expert on Kenyan urban Pentecostalism and, of course, Christianity more widely in Africa. He got his PhD in 2017 at Africa International University, and after a whole stint of different lectureships at various African universities, he's now stepped into, if I understand this right, the august footsteps of Lamin Sani at Yale. So many congratulations. It's also been a really great pleasure to have your contribution, Kyama, to the book, which has just come out, and this is like, they're still a bit warm, hot off the press, The Pentecostal World, where we have tried, Michael Wilkinson and I, to kind of challenge the received knowledge on Pentecostalism and actually looking forward to how this needs to change. And you contribute an excellent chapter on the history of Kenyan urban Pentecostalism, which again, localizes the story a lot more than is usually done. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you today and the paper you're going to give us, again, on Kenyan Pentecostalism. Welcome, Kyama, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get the technology to work here. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this gathering. The subject that I talk about today is one that I am passionate about, and one that I have written on. So as I share the screen here, excellent. Thank you very much. So yeah, so to the organizers, this has been somewhat long in coming. I have really looked forward to participate in this forum, and hopefully in the not so distant future I would like to be there in person and to interact with people there. Let me start by talking about my motivations for writing this book, A Spirit of Revitalization, which is from which I'm going to be basing some of these thoughts, and which will form kind of the framework of the presentation for the day. I wrote the book out of a number of motivations. One of them was the need for a history of Pentecostalism in Kenya. And we have a number of good pieces from West Africa. We have some good work from Southern Africa. But I wanted to contribute something from Eastern Africa. And since Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing expressions of Christianity in the global South, I wanted to, part of the story written about Kenya. And I wanted to give people names, places, faces, contexts, relationships that contributed to this growth. And this would serve as one of the examples of what has happened in other parts of Africa in terms of the growth of Pentecostalism. But the second reason for me came out of a frustration, and I was unsatisfied with a number of unhelpful studies of Pentecostalism that are focused on extremes and excesses of Pentecostalism on the continent. And what happens with these studies, they kind of fuel a negative stereotype of Pentecostalism at the expense of clarity and thoughtful research, which is why I really appreciate the Pentecostal World book, which is trying to help in those kinds of conversations. So I wanted to participate in research that dignifies the subject of study enough for when the criticism comes in, for it to be useful. So Pentecostalism in Africa, simply by way of definition, is a family of related expressions that have developed over time. And they're difficult to define because of their diversity. And because their diversity, they are a family of expressions, some of which are found within existing denominations. It's easier to define them by their emphasis rather than by specific denominational, affiliations or doctrinal positions. So, and this family of expressions, while adhering to mostly, Nicene orthodoxy, they, by definition, emphasize their worship. In their worship, the immanence of God through the proliferation of experiences with the Holy Spirit, and this consists of what some people would call power encounters, and these include healing, deliverance, miraculous provision, speaking in tongues, words of knowledge, and so on. When you come to the denominational differences, then that becomes a little different because some of them will emphasize tongues as initial evidence, others will not. So the book examines Pentecostalism using a historical approach, and I singled out a number of themes. I singled out 3 themes which I engaged with: orality, that is the preference of spoken forms of communication and epistemologies. I looked at kinship, which is a family relationship and the sense of connectedness one with another, and the social implications, social and religious implications of this connection. I also considered a holistic worldview, what might be referred by some to some as integrated cosmology, a way of looking at the world that emphasizes the connectedness between spirit world and the physical world. But those are not the only ways one could examine this religious phenomenon. I think there are other themes that one may consider, for example, conversion, and there's a little work that has been done on that, ontology, aesthetics, people's sense of beauty, politics, economics, and so on. But I narrowed down on orality, kinship, and an integrated worldview. For today's lecture, I'm going to do an overview of some of what I found in the book and some of my research, ongoing research. And I will use the reflections of 2 scholars in my overview today. Harvey Cox, in the mid-1960s, wrote The Secular City. It's a widely read book, reprinted in a number of times, most recently in 2014. And in the reprint, he argued, and I agree, that the book's thesis is still relevant in understanding the modern, I'm going to say, Western city and its relationship with Christianity. In that book, he argued that secularization is separate from secularism. Secularism is an ideological view about a world in which state and religion are separate, but secularization is a process, and the process of separating religion from structures of society. Even if both the ideology and the process are acting in the same place, they are different. Secularization, liberating society from society and culture from religious control and metaphysical worldviews, Cox argued, does not produce a society that is free of religion. Rather, in his view, this was, and this was very radical in the 1960s, the product of secularization is a society in which God acts in both the secular and the sacred spheres. This might not sound, profound today if viewed from the perspective of an integrated cosmology, such as what is prevalent in the global South. But it was, very novel in his day, and Cox's argument, I think, is valuable in reflecting on the modern African city, which has experienced the impact of secularizing forces coming out of global connections. So to those with integrated worldviews, God acts in the secular and the sacred spheres. Cox's book at the time, caused waves and was radical because he was not arguing for the death of God like many secularists were arguing for at the time. he was pointing to a new understanding on the importance of religion in the modern city. He went on to write a book about Pentecostalism and make some arguments around that. It's an interesting book if you're able to read it or find it. At the first writing of the secular city, Christianity was nowhere as dominant in Africa as it is now. So the question that I would like to address today with this in view is, how does secularization in the way that Cox conceptualized happen in Africa? Is it even possible to reflect about religion in African cities in that sort of way? My second question comes from Peter Badger, who wrote a more recent book, The Many Altars of Modernity. And in that book, he addressed many themes as he tried to bring together in one volume his reflections as a sociologist of religion. I'll single out two. His themes are somewhat connected, but I'll single out two that I feel are relevant to our discussion. Badger argued that people are exposed to many different ways of conceptualizing and relating to their realities. They do not address their realities in just one way. And this is important as we talk about Pentecostals in urban Africa. African cities are an excellent case study of the many ways people have to conceptualize and relate with their realities. So if you think about the African urban resident, if you pick, someone like me living in Nairobi, and the picture that we have in front of us is a picture of Nairobi. If you pick someone like that, that person is at once a member of a family. They're a member of an ethnic group, and so they have an ethnic identity, of one kind or another. They have a national identity. They have a regional identity, and they have an African identity. This person also has a religious identity that is connected to all those different identities in different ways. And this person is also a part of the global world. They have a global awareness. And so Badger argued these are some of the that people conceptualize their realities in many ways. And this is just a picture of some of the different ways in which people negotiate that. But then he also argued that modern society depends on or is catalyzed by secular infrastructure. Whether there is religion or not, in the modern city, secular infrastructure plays a fundamental role in the way society configures itself. And I'm going to look more closely at this assertion in light of African Pentecostalism. And so this modern society is not monolithic. Badger argues, and I would agree, that it is more accurate to think today not just of a modernity as this one thing, but of modernities, because there are many ways of envisioning and living out the modern society. And so the question for us is this: how well can we understand the African city in light of Badger's understanding of modern society? What is the African city, and how do people see themselves in the midst of this diversity, the diverse human populations that contend with or try to negotiate their multiple identities? And how does religion interact with this? And one of the arguments I'll be making in light of these reflections is that Pentecostalism in urban Africa addresses these questions in ways that are somewhat different from what Cox and Badger envisioned. But I think, these contributions that I kind of bring to the fore today will bring to the fore some ways that can help us and enrich the reflections that we have. Pentecostalism, in fact, confronts modernity and secularization by asking the question that primal African religion would have asked. In the words of Laurenti Magesa of blessed memory, the theologian, Catholic theologian, he wrote a book that asked the question, what is not sacred? So we begin by considering the question of secularization in the African city. This is a picture of a park called Uhuru Park. it is what one would call a secular space. It's a recreational space with a pond. You can see lawns. It also has a podium. If you can look at the corrugated little podium thing that is right at the on the bottom right. And political meetings are held there. It's kind of an amphitheater. But the picture is taken from the top of the hill, and there's an amphitheater that kind of goes down from the flag all the way to the podium. The Kenyan Declaration of Independence happened on that podium in 1963, and the park was at the time, in those days, a secular space used for political gatherings. Less than a kilometer behind it, you will see the secular, another secular space, the seat of government. If you see, you'll see a set of buildings, a complex of buildings with a clock, right after a row of trees. The parliament and the government offices are next to the park, which is adjacent to the central business district. And the business district now, flows from behind there. There are government offices and so on. There's the iconic kind of spaceship type of building over there, the Kenyatta International Convention Center. And then there's, there are other government buildings around there, and then business buildings. So in Badger's terms, we see within this picture Kenya's secular infrastructure. This is the same park that I've just talked about, and within this park, these are political gathering. These pictures you can see, people are dressed in red garb. This was for a political party known as Jubilee Party that won the election in 2013. And you find other political gatherings using this space. In 2002, it was the Orange Movement. In 2022, you'll find, it was UDA which won the election, last year, and the president was inaugurated in this space. In the book, I talk about this space. In 1988, Reinhard Bonnke came for an evangelistic campaign that brought together several churches in Nairobi. And again, this picture is the same space, but this is now not a political gathering. These are people gathered for a crusade, a Christian gathering. In 1988, those many years ago, the crusade that happened there was the biggest Protestant gathering that had ever been done by that time. It was not the first religious gathering. A couple of years before that, Pope John Paul had conducted the largest Catholic mass that Kenya had known at the time in a different part of the park. But Bonnke's crusade, and Bonnke is this German televangelist, left a lasting impression in the Kenyan social and religious landscape. It was characterized by open-air preaching, healing, deliverance, exorcism, mass conversions. Thousands of people were converted there. And the meetings harnessed a new large-scale, public address technology, some of which had never been seen before. And the group also made use of mass media. And this gathering ushered in a crusade season, or a crusade culture that became a hallmark of Pentecostalism in the coming years. But rather than catalyze Pentecostalism, as one might think, I would argue that that crusade era of the 1990s brought out in open the growth that had been going on in the background. Indigenous, newer Pentecostal churches like Pentecostal Evangelistic Fellowship of Africa, Deliverance Church, full gospel churches of Kenya, whose bishop is actually there right on the left, began in the 1970s and came out in the open 10 to 20 years later after they were formed in meetings like this within the late 1980s into the 1990s. Allow me to talk about what those churches are, and to outline a little bit of the diversity of these churches. I go into a little bit more depth in the book, but there are those newer Pentecostal charismatic churches that have roots in classical Pentecostalism. Some are large and sophisticated, others are small. And here in this picture, you have two churches from the same denomination. We have Kenya Assemblies of God Faith Church in a small tin corrugated iron sheet, somewhere in the, out probably in a rural area on the margins of the city. And then we have ICC, which is a Kenya Assemblies of God Church in the middle of town, which is somewhat more sophisticated, as you can see, in terms of its building and the way it presents itself. These churches are self-sustaining, they're self-governing, they delink themselves financially and in terms of leadership from their North American and European roots. They have an evangelical theology, if you could call it that, which might differ on some points with their missionary denominations' views. And they've slowly been embracing technology. And there are a number of them. Kenya Assemblies of God, whose pictures you can see came out of Assemblies of God in the 1960s. Pentecostal Assemblies of God, PAG, in Kenya came out of Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada in the 1910s and 1920s. Pentecostal Evangelistic Fellowship of Africa, PEFA, comes out of Elim Ministry, and which in turn came out of Apostolic Faith. In the 1970s. These movements are different from their roots. Despite their North American and European history, these churches have done things differently. They have episcopized, they now have bishops, whereas Assemblies of God in other parts of the world have a different structure or different polity. Another feature is that long before the discussion about ordination of women, Kenya Assemblies of God already had women pastors in rural areas in Kenya. I once went to rural Western Kenya to attend a church elder's funeral. And when they called up the pastors who had come to be with the family, 70% of them were women. Then we have independent forms of newer Pentecostal charismatic churches. These are indigenous, they're independent, they do not trace their origin to Euro-American Pentecostalism. Deliverance Church, for example, and Full Gospel Churches of Kenya, whose bishop you can see there, the bottom right. Arthur Kitonga founded Redeemed Gospel Church in 1974. Deliverance Church is another of these, an independent movement founded in 1970. These churches demonstrate that African Christianity can be indigenously led, it can be self-sustaining, it can be self-propagating. They're missionary sending, they're very prolific in their church planting, and they evolve their own ecclesial structures and articulate Christianity in the way that they see it. And they readily identify as Pentecostal within both urban settings and rural settings. The movement of church culture in these Pentecostal churches usually starts from cities and flows into the rural areas. Now I want to talk about other strands within newer Pentecostal charismatic churches, just to kind of illustrate the diversity within these movements. We have what I have called evangelistic ministry churches. These were not founded as churches. They are the product of itinerant ministers who travel to the cities inspired by a vision for conversion. The leader's sense of call was catalyzed generally by the crusade movement happening in the 1990s in Africa and other parts of the world. These leaders drew inspiration from what they had in those, what they experienced in those crusades, what they had, what they read, because they read a lot of the material from the crusade culture, from televangelists and so on, what they saw in the mass media. And many of them, of the early ones, will credit their call to the profound experiences at the crusades. Not all of them, but the ones founded in the 1990s. And their leaders moved out of the churches that they were into itinerant ministry. And they planned their own crusade or planned their own outreach ministries and raised their own resources to do this. These movements morphed into churches, and we have prominent examples that I write about. Many of them are led by women. Margaret Wanjiru, who's pictured here, is the leader of Jesus is Alive Ministries. Teresia Wairimo leads Faith Evangelistic Ministries. I'll be talking about her shortly. There are others as well. Pierce Moiro of Maximum Miracle Center, popularly known in Swahili as Kunanuru Gizani. We have others as well, even more recent ones, Ezekiel Odero as well. These were itinerant ministers who then planted churches coming out of their itinerant ministry. They did a lot of itinerant ministry in villages, in cities around the country, in schools, especially high schools in the country. These churches retain the ethos of evangelism with frequent calls for conversion. So their worship services run very much like evangelistic meetings every Sunday. Many of these churches learned how to harness television, radio, and now social media for evangelism. They espouse a theology of concrete religion where God is acting here and now, and they're speaking to Cox's idea of God in the city, in our lived realities. And so to these Pentecostals, God speaks into everything. He speaks into finances, into health, into every facet of people's existence within the urban city. The high points in their worship service are the miracle moment or the power encounter, the prophecy, the call, and then the call for conversion. And their sermons are geared towards these moments. There is another type of newer Pentecostal charismatic church, a more recent one, which I call media and entrepreneurial churches. These churches started largely through media initiatives or entrepreneurial empowerment initiatives. Kathy Kuna, pictured here in yellow, and her husband, Alan Kuna, are founders of Jubilee Christian Center. There are other churches like those in Nairobi as well. Papa Center, now known as Ruach Ministries. There's Empowerment Christian Church in Nairobi led by Lucy Natasha. They emphasize sleek professionalism in their worship services. Their ministry is made for media. Their leaders at the front maintain very polished appearances. Their hair is carefully put together. The women who put on makeup, as you can see right there, their clothing is coordinated with a very well developed sense of aesthetic. The idea is to project an image of a community and a God of order and beauty. They also have a very strongly aspirational aspect, so that the leaders will model in their appearances, in the material that goes out, like you can see the pictures here, in their public life, what their congregations would like for themselves. And so, wealth, material wealth and things like those, health, looking good, all those are values that are important, and that go together in the package of their understanding of who God is. Now, they within their theology, there is room, for things like salvation, for the cross, and so on. But it's an integrated view, and it integrates all these other things as well. An important aspect of these expressions is their emphasis on business. Even though they encourage people to pray for their circumstances, for their realities, people like Alan Kuna, Julian Chula, Nii Morakinyo have books and recorded talks that talk about how to start businesses, how to deal with people's economic realities, how to thrive in urban financial settings, how to work hard so that one can live an empowered Christianity that is lived in the marketplace. Lucy Natasha's church is called the Empowerment Christian Church, just to kind of emphasize this. These churches encourage entrepreneurship in business and in life in general. They constantly encourage their members to pray that God will help them to do well or to thrive, but also that God will help them to do something for themselves, so that they're not perpetually dependent on others, so that they can help others. Life for them is not just, the Christian life is not for them just a spiritual reality, but also a concrete, lived reality. One of the interesting things I have found is that of the categories of churches that we have described of the Neo Pentecostal churches, this particular group of churches are the most overt in the sense of kinship. The pastor and his wife are considered mother and father of the community, or mom and dad of the community. Their members use these familial terms for their leaders. The leaders use the terms to refer to themselves, to refer to one another. And in addition to that, the pastor's mentor is, described as the pastor's mom and dad. So Kathy and Kuna's mentor is their mom. And since, Kathy and Alan Kuna's mentor is their mom, the congregation see themselves within a family framework, and they see themselves as spiritual grandchildren. And so despite the sleek modern outlook, these churches retain these references to kinship in ways that are different from other areas in modern secular society, but are very similar to primal communality out of which they're coming from. And again, this is their identity coming back and their worldview coming back. One last group that I would like to consider is progressive Pentecostal churches, which are also part of this, a subset of this larger group, the newer Pentecostal charismatic churches. Now, these ones, this term comes out of Tetsunao Yamamori and Donald Miller's research, multi-year, multi-city research that produced the book Global Pentecostalism. These churches engage with questions that the other expressions that I have talked about have been slow to answer. They ask, for example, what do we do with the structures in society that have failed people? What do we do with political structures that are not working? They question the efficacy of secular structures upon which modern African society is built, going back to Badger's framework there. They will ask, what do we do with health institutions that are not addressing the social health needs? What do we do with an economy that is failing within an African context? And these churches, progressive Pentecostal churches, carry on as Pentecostals or as charismatic. Now, some of them might not use the term Pentecostal or themselves, or they might not carry some of the denominational Pentecostal thoughts or ideas or doctrinal positions, but they carry the defining characteristics I talked about in the immanence of God through the Holy Spirit, the emphasis on spiritual gifts and so on. And despite their Pentecostal charismatic outlook, they're very concerned about their own responses to the question they raise to society. So not only are they asking those questions about society and challenging the society itself, but they're also internally reflecting on these things. So, for example, Christ is the Answer ministries in the recent past, have challenged the government on policies and governance of various kinds. They've been known to ask questions about transparency in governance, accountability in elections, and corruption and the economy, and they'll ask those out in public. During the election period, they'll encourage people to pray for the nation, but also to go out and vote to get the right kind of leaders. They'll find ways to articulate some of these realities in spiritual terms. So, for example, they'll say, go cast your vote because it's your responsibility, but the outcome belongs to God. But these churches also aim to model what they're asking of society. Churches like, Christ is the Answer Ministry, Nairobi Chapel, and so on, and like other Pentecostal expression, will model the kind of accountability that they want to see. They'll post their audited accounts online, which is unusual for other Pentecostal churches, other groupings of Pentecostal churches. They have defined their leadership development processes and the succession plans. And these churches attract educated middle-income and urban dwellers. And their annual budgets and their giving is considerably larger in relation to some of the smaller Pentecostal churches. So, for example, Crisis Answer Ministries has an annual budget of about $2 million equivalent. And they account for this money, in the public to their members, and the money is used to run their schools, to run their churches, to start new churches, to fund missions, to run an orphanage, to run a media station, and even support a university. So one last group that I would like to talk about are not newer Pentecostal, do not fall within that category of newer Pentecostal charismatic churches. They fall within the historic mission churches, but are carry the same values in terms of their approach to the Holy Spirit, and these are the charismatic movements within churches, or charismatic Christians, or however you want to call them. In Kenya we have the Vincentians, for example, and I'm taking this a Catholic example here. You can find some of these groupings amongst the Anglicans, amongst the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, and so on, Methodists, and so on. We have Vincentian, the Vincentian movement in Kenya. These are Catholic priests, initially mostly from India. The picture that we have here is from the retreat center in Thika, which is a huge center every weekend is filled with hundreds of people, coming in for retreats. But you can find in their sermons, they are very sensitive to the attendees' context. They have prayer services in the city every Monday and Thursday where people come for healing, and they do a mass, a healing mass, have prayer together. And so this is one stream of charismatic Catholic movements. And then we have small groups which meet in people's homes, Jumuiya groups. These were previously called base communities where people care for one another. In these groups, people pray for healing, they pray over people, and interact together. And one of the key differences between these charismatic movements and the Pentecostal churches that I've talked about is their rootedness within their denominations. Of course, this comes with certain advantages and sometimes some tensions as well. But in terms of the advantages, these charismatic movements amongst the Catholics or Anglicans or within these groupings, historic mission churches, retain their doctrine, and they sustain their approach to secular structures in society. But they attempt to express their charismatic ideals within, for example, the Catholic spirituality without losing that denominational connection. The thing is, this is a constant negotiations and the outcomes are not guaranteed. So there are those who leave and join Pentecostal churches as they try to manage that, but most of them will remain and thrive in the tension, as you can see in this picture here, where you find there are a lot of Catholics. This would mostly be Catholics here. And so that's the charismatic movement that you find among historic mission churches. Let me now look at close as I come to a close. Look at a couple of themes that are important to think about, and one of these is Pentecostalism and women. Pentecostalism challenges the power structures that you find within historic mission churches, and also in part, in the political and possibly even the economic system. Pentecostals' idea of democratized charisma within their pneumatology allows women, for example, to influence society in ways that are not common in either business or politics or even in historic mission church polity. The picture that we have here is of Teresia Wairimu. She's an important spiritual leader in Kenya. She's hosted presidents in her gatherings. Her New Year's services receive much online and media attention because she gives scripture-based prophecies for the country. Unlike some Pentecostal leaders, she tends to root her presentation, her prophecies on biblical themes. The current Kenyan First Lady was a regular member of her church, And after her husband won the election and became president, one of the first places that the first lady attended was Wairimu's church. Wairimu's proximity to power structures, not just in this last election, but over time, is an indication of the extent to which the public's perception of spiritual calling and gifts matters over for example, the notion of gender. Wairimu is a single parent who was divorced in the early 1990s, and her story, in my view, represents Pentecostalism's ability to rewrite the rules of acceptability for women in leadership. Pentecostalism reframes the rules of appropriateness of women in leadership without changing the ideas of personal piety. For example, Wairimu, someone who was divorced, is a single mother, can now be an influential leader in the country and teach about marriage and teach about abstinence and even talk about the politics of the land. Kathy Kuna, who is her spiritual daughter, is another example. She had a child out of wedlock. However, she has overcome this seeming obstacle, and she's now married and has other children and leads what many would consider a successful, highly visible ministry, one branch of which is a regular gathering for women, daughters of Zion. And so Pentecostalism allows women to have significant influence in this new configuration of Christianity. And women have a central role to play in African Christianity in general, but also in Kenyan urban Pentecostalism in particular. Motherhood is an important theme that comes out with in the area of women in Pentecostalism. There can be no church in Africa without thinking about women and their role, and this in multiple ways. On the one hand, you have Telesia Wairimu, who have talked about Kathy Kuna or Natasha Lucy as examples of leading women Pentecostals. But then you'll also see the role of women in the composition of churches, where more women attend than men, in the small groups where a lot of spiritual activity also happens. You find that as well. But as a testament to its globality, this Pentecostalism also allows people from outside the country to speak into the Kenyan situation. So we have, for example, Esther Obasike, who's one example of a senior woman leader at the Redeemed Christian Church of God in Nairobi. She's a Nigerian who's now become very influential in Kenya. Telesia and especially Kathy Kuna regularly invite West African women, and just generally, West Africans and people from other parts of Africa to come into their women gatherings to do their ministry. I turn now to Pentecostalism and the youth. My chapter in the Pentecostal world that we talked about a little earlier was about young people. Africa is a young continent. Median age in Africa is 19. Africa south of the Sahara, some would say the median age is 18. For comparison's sake, North America median age is 35 and Europe's is 42. So if you take individual countries, Kenya's median age is 19, Tanzania is 18, Burundi is 17, Uganda is 16, Malawi and Zambia in Southern Africa, median age 17. In West Africa, Benin, median age is 17, Niger is 15. The point is made that Africa is a young continent. And if you're going to talk about Christianity in Africa, you're essentially having conversations about the youth. It's also true, in terms of especially Muslim countries south of the Sahara. There's a strong representation of the youth in both amongst urban and rural Christians, and the church is important for young people. One study done in Kenya found that children and teenage youth still consider church an important part of their lives. And so as a subset of Christianity, Pentecostalism in Africa is by extension a young experience. And there are two streams of young people in Pentecostalism that illustrate this significance of the youth in Africa in relation to Christianity. One stream of youth experiences comes out of education infrastructure, and the other comes out of media. And both of them show that Pentecostalism has the power to capture the imagination and inspire innovation among young people. Christian student movements, and that's the picture that I have for you there, are a very visible force in the education system. Central to this story is the Fellowship of Christian Unions in Kenya, Focus, originally affiliated with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, began in the 1960s, was formally registered in the 1970s, and is an umbrella body that houses Christian unions. And Christian unions is the name given for student gatherings in high schools and colleges. And they are often very entrepreneurial. The gatherings start spontaneously. If a school does not have a gathering, they act like revival movements in form and function within the schools. And within these unions, students engage in charismatic forms of Christianity. And their gatherings are very cosmopolitan and very ecumenical. This is because the schools themselves are melting pots of ethnic and regional diversity. And since there are fewer schools than the school-going, the school-going population, the school system is merit-based or private. People pay. The public system is merit-based, and so you find that the few schools draw people from a wide area, bringing in people in multiple contexts, multiple denominational backgrounds. And the schools become a microcosm of the cosmopolitanism you find in cities. That is the same also you'd find in, same as what you would find in universities as well. The Christian Union in Kenyatta University is the largest in the country, and that's the picture that I have for you. But it brings together 3,000 students every Sunday. That would constitute a mega church by many counts, and it's self-led. The students organize themselves, they run it, the students even fund it, and its operations are run from within the student infrastructure of the university. Highly charismatic. And this is one area that I've been studying over time, and investigating the communal kinship language found within its organization. The leaders of the movement, if they are male, they are referred to as the dad. And so, I found it curious, together with 5 other researchers, for people to designate a parental kinship term to a colleague who is only 3 years older than them. It's a peculiar phenomenon that we are investigating in a grant funded by Nagel Institute out of Calvin University. Finally, the other young people's Christian expression is Christian youth in the pop culture. Christian pop culture have, the community has defined itself as key contributors to Christian youth activities. They engage with various art forms, but music and to some extent dance are the main forms of pop culture. Much of the activities in the grassroots, youth groups within Pentecostal churches, a few movement leaders mobilize resources from corporates and from the youth themselves to mount big gatherings. A group called Kubamba organizes a gathering called Totally Sold Out, of which the picture that you are seeing is a subset. These groups bring together, Kubamba brings together thousands of youth to fields, in the big cities in Kenya to participate in evangelistic concerts, to pray, over the new year. To pray the new year into being. The groups are very innovative. They find and learn new social media platforms and use them as evangelistic tools. They're constantly innovating new events, reinventing ways of engaging with the youth. They're constantly finding ways of connecting young people with one another in that very fluid experience that we call the African city. Now, this is a music group from a conference in one of the progressive Pentecostal churches. As I come to a conclusion, I want to argue that the dynamics of the city in Africa illustrate just how significant secularization forces are in urban Africa. Pentecostalism is a potent force that so far has kept secularism, the ideology, at bay in Africa, or is one of the forces that has kept secularism at bay. It sets itself, Pentecostalism sets itself to challenge the notion that religion can be separated from the institutions and structures. It challenges secularization in the format that we talked about earlier. Different expressions of Pentecostalism make the case for religion in society, either through the structures or in spite of the structures. This is true whether it's students acting within educational structures, or progressive Pentecostals challenging economic and political structures, or evangelistic ministry churches countering the society's evils with prayer. Pentecostalism in Africa, as I have seen it, affirms the notion that God is at work in the city, helping people navigate their lives and determining outcomes for themselves within the city. It does so in a different way than Cox envisioned in his observation of Western cities. And in this regard, the Pentecostal does not see the city as free of God or trying to free itself of God. In fact, the city is a place where people find God, whether you are a young person looking for God, or you are a woman that is looking for God. It positions itself as the religious experience for anybody who's trying to find meaning in the city. How then are we to understand the African city in light of this? If we look at this question through Badger's themes that we discussed above, we find a couple of things. Badger argues that modernity in the city is dependent on secular infrastructure. In my view, Pentecostals challenge that notion. They proceed as if the city and the people that live within those structures in the cities, or people who operate those structures that are said to be secular, are in effect sacred within within their cosmology. To put it differently, there is no place where God isn't there. Furthermore, Pentecostals uphold as central to urban realities the idea of communality and its cognates of kinship and ethnicity. The social reality of the city is very much a spiritual reality for them. How people relate in the city is a spiritual thing. The secular structures in Africa presently make for a broken city. We all know that, we read about it, we hear about it. The political, economic, health, education, and so on structures are deficient. This is partly because they're housed within young democracies with fledgling economies, and there are many reasons around these failures. The social fabric is weaker than in these cities than it is in the rural areas, and than it was in primal societies. However, Pentecostalism seeks to construct a new communality around which people can organize themselves and make sense of their realities in religion. And so this Pentecostalism enables Africans to find meaning in a rapidly changing, very dynamic context that we call the city in Africa. And they do this with a local perspective, but an identity, but also a global awareness. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyama, for such a fascinating run through your very expansive work in Kenya and in the urban environment. I like how you framed this with Harvey Cox. I guess my own reading of Over has always been one of a conversion, from a liberal sort of book in the 70s, The Secular City, and then kind of say, well, I made a few mistakes led on by theologians, and actually Pentecostalism is a story, and perhaps both are the story, right? I mean, there is going to be an urban, intellectual, secular environment in Kenya, as well as a very religious environment, say in America, or even here in England.